While often viewed as a morally contentious practice, execution remains the ultimate penalty for society's most heinous offenders. Yet sometimes, the sight of these condemned individuals struggling to come to terms with reality in the final moments before their death can evoke deep emotions. Grab a tissue and walk with me as I explore the darkest annals of history to reveal the most heartbreaking executions of all time. George Stinney. Born on the 21st of October 1929, George Stinney Jr. grew up in the small town of Alcaloo in Clarendon County, South Carolina. His family lived in a home provided by the sawmill company, which his father worked for, and he and his siblings were among the few privileged black students who had access to quality education. In early 1944, tragedy struck when two white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, went missing while on a bicycle ride in search of passion flowers. Their path led them to the Stinney property, where they asked George's sister about maypops. Ame gave them as much information as she could, and the girls were soon on their way in search of the flower, but they never returned. On the 23rd of March 1944, both Betty and Mary were found dead in a ditch in the Black American section of the town. Autopsies revealed they had been brutally beaten with a blunt object, causing severe injuries and penetrating their skulls. The community launched a frantic search for the girls, and suspicion soon fell on George and his brother John. Although John was eventually released, George remained in custody. Shockingly, George's arresting officer H.S. Newman claimed that the 14-year-old had confessed to the crime, a confession that would later prove dubious. "I arrested a boy by the name of George Stinney. He then made a confession and told me where to find a piece of iron about 15 inches, where he said he put it in a ditch about 6 feet from the bicycle." The prosecutors presented two different versions of George's confession. One claimed that one of the girls had fallen into the ditch, and when George tried to help her, they attacked him, and he killed them in self-defense. Another version of his confession claimed that he secretly trailed them after they met with his sister and killed them. Interestingly, both of these claims were verbal statements reported by the prosecutor, and none of them were challenged by Charles Plowden, a tax commissioner and local politician, who was appointed as George's counsel. As a matter of fact, Plowden didn't cross-examine any of the witnesses and did very little to help George's cause. The trial created a lot of buzz and was attended by over 1,000 white Americans, with no black individuals, including George's family, allowed in the courtroom. This feeling of injustice was even more pronounced when an all-white jury deliberated for just 2.5 hours before sentencing George Stinney to death by electrocution. And of course, his inefficient counsel didn't make efforts to appeal the judgment. At exactly 7:30 a.m. on the 16th of June, 1944, George was in tears in prison as he was executed. Decades later, in 2004, local historian George Frierson revisited the case and, with the help of 4 legal experts, unearthed compelling evidence to prove George Stinney had been wrongfully executed. Executed for watching K-drama. Residents in the Ryanggang province of North Korea were forced to watch in horror in October 2022 as 2 teenagers were executed for watching and distributing South Korean movies, popularly known as K-drama. These 2 unnamed teenagers, aged 16 and 17, were caught trying to sell a USB drive containing movies produced in South Korea. As is often the case within the confines of the Hermit Kingdom, these boys were denied any semblance of a fair trial, and details of their trial and eventual execution were shrouded in secrecy. However, inside sources believe the teenagers were arraigned at an airfield in Hiesa without a competent legal representative. On the day of their execution, the authorities forced several community members to attend the heartbreaking event, perhaps as a deterrent to anyone else who might be thinking of watching or distributing K-drama films or other foreign movies in North Korea. Similarly, another teenager was also sentenced and executed at the Hiesa airfield because he murdered his stepmother. Speaking after the execution, one anonymous source said, "The authorities put the teenage students in front of the public, sentenced them to death, and immediately shot them." Anywhere else in the world, this type of trial and execution would have been condemned, but apparently, it was just another day in North Korea. In fact, upon further investigation, it was confirmed that the teenagers actually got the actual judgment they deserved. North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un is extremely skeptical of foreign media content, including videos and images crossing into the country, and as such, he recommends very harsh punishments for anyone who watches or distributes them. According to reports, watching a South Korean movie or any other content produced in a foreign country attracts a 5-year sentence in a correction camp along with their parents. However, anyone caught distributing this content is handed the death penalty as approved by Kim Jong-un, the controversial leader of the country, who once approved the execution of his own uncle. Dalton Praan. In 1972, 11-year-old Dalton Praan was given a rude shock when he realized that the person he had called mother all his life was actually his aunt. This revelation triggered a profound psychological change in him. His behavior took a dark turn, marked by tantrums and uncontrollable outbursts, ultimately leading to his confinement at the Louisiana Training Institute. By March 1974, Dalton was facing charges of burglary, theft, and other minor offenses. 3 months later, Dalton had graduated to become a murderer after he shot a taxi driver named John Doucette. Dalton owned up to the crime, but prosecutors couldn't press charges after extensive medical examination showed that he was intellectually limited, so he was released in December 1976. 7 months later, in July 1977, Dalton was arrested once again, this time killing a police officer. Unlike his first murder trial, a psychological evaluation determined that he functioned within the realm of dull normal in the verbal domain, rendering him fit to stand trial. However, public concern grew over Dalton's mental struggles and his readiness for trial. In May 1978, a 12-man, all-white jury reached a devastating verdict, finding Dalton Praan guilty of murder and unanimously recommending the death penalty. As expected, the defense team appealed the verdict, citing Dalton's mental issues. The European Parliament and Amnesty International also lent their voice to the cause, calling for clemency and a re-evaluation of the evidence. I doubt that in documented recent world history there is an execution with such a pile of reasons not to do it, a representative of Amnesty International said. However, Louisiana governor at the time, Elson Buddy Romer, ignored their recommendation, saying, "On behalf of 780 state troopers and thousands of police officers who put their lives on the line every day, the execution will proceed." Consequently, Dalton Praan was executed by electric chair on May 18, 1990. Troy Davis. The execution of Troy Anthony Davis in September 2011 sparked a wave of global outrage, which eventually served as a precursor to the Black Lives Matter movement. Just before he was administered the lethal injection, Davis had a few lines of words for the family of the man he was accused of killing. "I know all of you are still convinced that I'm the person that killed your father, your son, and your brother, but I am innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun that night. I did not shoot your family member, but I am so sorry for your loss. I really am. Sincerely. All I can ask is that each of you look deeper into this case so that you really will finally see the truth." Davis's harrowing journey towards execution commenced on the 18th of August, 1989. He had been out partying with his friend, Daryl Collins, when they stumbled upon a heated altercation in the parking lot of a Burger King establishment. Amid the fray, Mark McPhail, an off-duty police officer who held a part-time security role at the restaurant, stepped in to douse the tension. All of a sudden, 2 bullets were fired. One of them pierced through McPhail's heart, while the other hit him in the face. Terrified by what they had just seen, Davis and Collins fled the scene. But as investigations began, some misguided eyewitnesses claimed Davis was the culprit. During the court proceeding, 7 witnesses say they saw Davis shoot McPhail. 2 other witnesses say he confessed the murder to them. And even though 6 witnesses testified in his defense, Troy Davis was convicted of murder and sentenced to death after 2 hours of trial in August 1991. The defense attorney appealed the verdict even as Davis continued to emphasize that he was innocent. The case gathered much publicity owing to the calls from several influential organizations urging the court to grant Davis a retrial or an evidentiary hearing. This includes Amnesty International and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. Influential figures like former President Jimmy Carter, Reverend Al Sharpton, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and former FBI Director and Judge William S. Sessions also waded in. Eventually, the court bowed to pressure and the court approved an evidentiary hearing. Consequently, Davis's execution dates were moved several times, but eventually he was executed by lethal injection on the 21st of September 2011. Minutes before his execution, Davis urged his friends and family to continue to pray and fight. "I ask my family and friends that you all continue to pray, that you all continue to forgive, continue to fight this fight. For those about to take my life, may God have mercy on all of your souls. God bless you all." Thomas Granger. In 1942, Governor William Bradford served as judge over one of the most controversial cases in the history of the Plymouth colony of the British in North America. Thomas Granger, a servant to Love Brewster of Duxbury, was caught engaging in lewd practice with a turkey. Upon further interrogation, the teenage servant confessed he had been having regular sex with other animals on the Plymouth plantation, including horses, cows, goats, and sheep. At the time, there were no laid-down rules for such crimes, perhaps because they never imagined that anyone would engage in such an act of sodomy. After extensive deliberations, Governor William Bradford concluded that a death sentence was the appropriate punishment for Granger. This was based on the law highlighted in Leviticus chapter 20 verses 15, which recommends that if a man lies with a beast, the man should be put to death, and the defiled beast shall be slayed. Granger was only between the age of 16 and 17 at the time, so you could argue that he wasn't fully aware of the gravity of the crime he committed. In addition, he argued that his action was born out of boredom. "I was an only servant, alone, unmarried, in the town of Duxbury," Granger said. "I was gentle with the animals, and they were gentle with me. I wasn't lonely, it was boredom exactly." Unfortunately for him, neither the governor nor members of the local magistrates saw this as enough reason to pardon him. For starters, the authorities compelled Granger to pinpoint all the animals he had had sex with. Then they slaughtered them and buried their body in a ditch. On the 7th of September 1642, Granger was convicted of buggery with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, divers sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. Detailing this event in his diary, Governor William Bradford wrote, "He was this year detected of buggery and indicted for the same, with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. Horrible it is to mention, but the truth of the history requires it." And consequently, he was hanged on the 8th of September 1642 by a court messenger named John Holmes. Critically, Granger's gross act was one of the first recorded acts of bestiality in the Plymouth British colony. In addition, he was one of the first people to be hanged within the colony and the first known juvenile to be sentenced to death and executed in the United States. Hannah Ackish. On July 21, 1786, 6-year-old Eunice Bowles waved her family goodbye as she headed for school. But unknown to them, that was the last time they would see her alive. A few hours after leaving the house, it was confirmed that Eunice had gone missing. The community rallied together, deploying every resource at their disposal to conduct a thorough search, and by 10 a.m., the search team had found her dead body. Her once bright smile had faded, replaced by a gruesome reality. Her skull bore a fracture, and her small frame was marked with numerous bruises. The quest for Eunice's killer led to a series of interrogations within the community, one of which involved a young girl named Hannah Ackish. Although there was no concrete evidence to substantiate her claims, Hannah's testimony became the linchpin of the investigation. She admitted to witnessing 4 boys near the crime scene that day, and her words carried the weight of truth in the eyes of the authorities. So they invited her to the Bowl family home for questioning. During the interrogation, which was conducted in the presence of Eunice's dead body, Hannah broke down in tears and confessed to the crime. Interestingly, there was a backstory that seemingly validated Hannah's confession and the intent behind why she could have wanted to kill Eunice. Some weeks earlier, Eunice and Hannah were involved in a fight when the former accused the latter of stealing strawberry fruit during a harvest, so it made sense to believe that she was responsible for the murder. But then again, there was enough physical evidence to suggest that this narrative was either false or Eunice may have been murdered by Hannah in error. Hannah Ackish suffered from a chronic mental disability order, which many people within the neighborhood were aware of. Some people argued that her mental struggle and the fact that she was only 12 years old at the time made her unfit to stand trial. But the judge didn't buy that idea. Instead, he was more concerned about using her case to send a strong deterrent message to the public. The sparing of you on account of your age would, as the law says, be of dangerous consequence to the public by holding up an idea that children might commit such atrocious crimes with impunity, the judge said. Based on this argument, Hannah was sentenced to death by hanging. Her trial was such an emotional scene that left both the presiding judge and many people in the audience in tears. Hannah initially seemed oblivious to her fate, but as the execution date drew closer, she started to suffer from anxiety and often spent most of her time crying. On the day of her execution, spectators noted with disappointment how frightened Hannah looked, perhaps looking for someone to come to her aid. But unfortunately, there was no help in sight. Mustafa Al Darwish. In May 2015, a teenager named Mustafa Abdullah Al-Huwaidi and 2 of his friends were arrested by the Saudi police in Tarout for their participation in anti-government protests. After a brief interrogation, the 3 boys were released, but their phones were confiscated. Subsequently, the authorities went through Mustafa's phone and found pictures that offended the leadership of the country, so they invited him under the guise that they were willing to return his phone. Unknown to Mustafa, this was a plot to incarcerate and eventually execute him. At the time of his arrest, Mustafa was just 14 years old. However, the government didn't treat him like a juvenile. They placed him in solitary confinement. In addition, they beat, tortured, and forced him to accept a charge of robbing a jewelry store at gunpoint. During his trial, Mustafa told the jury that he made the confession under duress and after several sessions of torture. This confirmed the suspicions of many human rights groups who believed that the Saudi authorities were violating the rights of hundreds of prisoners, essentially breaking domestic and international law. Despite Mustafa's explanation and the fact that he was still a minor when he committed the crime, the jury sentenced him to death. Worse of all, the government kept the execution plan away from the public, ultimately denying him the luxury of saying his final goodbye to friends and family. In fact, the family only got to find out about Mustafa's death on the 21st of June 2021, when Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Interior announced that he had been executed for using arms to revolt against the ruler, destabilizing security, and forming an armed terrorist cell. These claims obviously contradicted the charges he was initially accused of. It also goes against the position of the royal decree announced by the Saudi Human Rights Commission and the promises made by Saudi leaders to the United Nations, stating that offenders who commit a death-eligible crime as a minor will be given a maximum 10-year sentence instead of the death penalty. In response, Mustafa's family released an emotional statement criticizing the government's actions. How can they execute a boy because of a photograph on his phone? Since his arrest, we have known nothing but pain. It is a living death for the whole family. The execution of Mustafa sparked a widespread rage as human rights activists called for the Saudi authorities to stop acting with impunity when prosecuting offenders, especially juveniles. Cameron Todd Willingham. On the 23rd of December 1991, a young Texas family of 5, including Cameron Todd Willingham, his wife Stacy Kuykendall, and 3 daughters, were in a jubilant mood anticipating Christmas. But fate had other ideas. Stacy stepped out to buy presents at a local store, leaving Todd Willingham at home to look after the girls. While his wife was out, Todd decided to catch a nap, and by the time he woke, his life never remained the same again. A vicious fire had broken out while he was sleeping, killing everyone in the house except him. As if the hurt of losing his 3 children in a fire incident wasn't enough, prosecutors named Willingham as the prime suspect in the incident. Based on the testimony of forensic experts, the jury concluded that Willingham had intentionally set his house on fire with the intention of killing his children. During the trial, the jury also listened to the testimony of an inmate who claimed that Willingham had confessed to him. On the 29th of October 1992, Todd Willingham was sentenced to death. Of course, the judgment was immediately appealed, and Willingham would remain incarcerated for over a decade until he was executed by lethal injection on the 17th of February 2004. With this, it appeared that the case had been brought to a conclusion. However, an investigative report by the Chicago Tribune several months later raised questions about how the case was handled. Also, it was revealed that Willingham's attorney had submitted a report to the governor and the Board of Pardon and Parole, which showed that the forensic analysis on which the execution sentence was based was wrong. Despite the fact that this report was prepared by Gerald Hurst, a prominent arson expert, both the governor and the board failed to act upon.
You had the wife come down within the last week and stand up and say, this man told me that he murdered our children. You have the defender who wrote me a letter and said, this man killed his children.
Interestingly, a group of 5 world-class independent arson experts hired by the Innocence Project also came to the conclusion that none of the scientific analysis used to convict Willingham was valid. In September 2009, an investigative report by The New Yorker went one step further when it revealed that all the forensic analysis, the informant's testimony, and all circumstantial evidence submitted to the court were invalid. Unfortunately, all of this information came a little bit too late, as an innocent man had already been executed, William Jackson Marian. 6 months after his wedding with Lydia Jane Finley, William Jack Jackson Marian embarked on an interesting journey in search of greener pastures with his close friend, John Cameron. The intention of these close buddies was to travel from Liberty, Nebraska to Valley Falls, Kansas to work on a railroad project, but along the way, they stopped briefly in Wildcat Creek to visit Marian's mother-in-law, Rachel Warren, before proceeding to Gage County. At Gage County, Marian made an advance payment to Cameron for a team of horses from Cameron. By the time he returned to visit Rachel again on the 5th of May 1872, he was accompanied by a large convoy of horses, including those belonging to James Cameron. Interestingly, Cameron himself was nowhere to be found. Marian's mother-in-law suspected that something was fishy. Her immediate suspicion was that Marian would have had something to do with Cameron's sudden disappearance, but since there was no evidence to back up her suspicions, she kept her thoughts to herself. After a few days, Marian left with the team of horses, even as James Cameron remained missing. The search for Cameron continued until March 1873, when residents of Gage County in Nebraska found a decomposing body with 3 bullet holes in the skull around the riverbed. Some of the residents claimed that the corpse was wearing a fabric that was similar to the cloth that Cameron was wearing when he was last seen. Based on this testimony, the sheriff concluded that Marian must have been responsible for Cameron's death, so a manhunt was launched for Jackson Marian. This search went on for many years until December 1882, when Marian was found in Kansas, where he was standing trial for stealing. But little did he know that his impasse with the law was about to get worse. After learning the murder murder charge leveled against him, the jury in Kansas approved Marian's transfer to Nebraska. After a 2-month trial in Nebraska, a jury convicted Jackson Marian of murder and sentenced him to death by hanging. Marian's attorney appealed the verdict, hoping that a retrial could help to exonerate him. Unfortunately, the appeal was thrown out, and Marian's death sentence was upheld. Consequently, Jackson Marian was hanged in Beatrice, Nebraska on the 25th of March, 1887, to the delight of many residents. In fact, just 24 hours after his execution, the Omaha Daily Bee published a story claiming that Marian was guilty of the crime and also guilty of other murders in the Indian Territory. Surprisingly, James Cameron showed up in La Crosse, Kansas in 1891. Apparently, he relocated to Mexico in a bid to avoid a woman who claimed to have given birth for him, and sadly, he didn't know about the false accusation leveled against his friend until after the execution. Napoleon Beasley. Meet Napoleon Beasley, an honor student and one-time senior class president at the Grapeland High School, with unfailing good character that sacrificed his endless potential and multiple opportunities for a life of crime that earned him the death sentence. His fate as a death row candidate was basically sealed on April 19, 1994. On the evening of this said day, Napoleon returned home, grabbed a Haskell .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol, and tucked it into his pants. Then he heads out to link up with Cedric and Donald Fig Coleman, and the 3 childhood friends drive first to Corsicana and then to Tyler in search for a vehicle to carjack. At about 11 p.m., they spotted a cream-colored Mercedes-Benz. They trailed the car until it was packed in a lush garage encircled by a manicured garden. By then, the driver of the vehicle and his wife, who was seated right next to him, knew exactly what was going on. They were about to be robbed and were more than happy to cooperate with the attackers, but Napoleon wasn't in the mood for dialogue. He hastily pulled the trigger, hitting the driver on the head. He followed up with another shot, aiming for the passenger in the car. His shot narrowly missed, but he couldn't care less. The coast was now clear for him and the Coleman brothers to steal the car, and that was all that mattered, at least in the moment. However, in the hours following the incident, Napoleon and his crew would learn that the victim of their first ever robbery attempt was no ordinary person. He was John Luddig, a stupendously rich businessman and the father of Honorable J. Michael Luddig, a federal judge who sits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. It took just 47 days for the FBI to track down Napoleon, Cedric, and Donald. After a swift trial, Napoleon was sentenced to death, while Cedric and Donald were sentenced to 40 years imprisonment. "I made choices, bad choices," Napoleon said. "A lot of people grew up with the same opportunities and challenges I had, and they didn't end up on death row." It was a heartbreaking moment for the 17-year-old, who many had high hopes for. But how exactly did Napoleon go from being one of the brightest prospects from Texas to becoming a convict at the age of 17? Apparently, he had been introduced to the business of selling crack at the age of 13 by his cousin Timmy, and even though he was able to hide it from his parents and close friends, Napoleon was fast slipping into the world of crime. This and some other personal issues wore him out mentally, such that when Cedric casually tabled the idea of hijacking a car, he didn't think twice before he jumped at the opportunity. Unfortunately for Napoleon, it was an opportunity that would cost him his career, freedom, and life. James Arsene. On the 25th of November, 1872, James Arsene and a Cherokee man named William Parchmeal spotted William Feigl, a Swedish immigrant, buying something at a local store in Fort Smith. They trailed him quickly to about 2 miles outside the fort, and once they caught up with him, they robbed him of his belongings, including his boots and money worth around 25 cents at the time. Arsene reportedly smashed a huge stone on Feigl's head. The victim was also shot 6 times, but historians are not exactly clear whether it was Arsene or Parchmeal who pulled the trigger. Eventually, the culprits were apprehended and tried for the charges of robbery and murder, but somehow they escaped and eluded arrest for 12 years until 1884, when U.S. Deputy Marshal Andrews uncovered new evidence that linked James and William to the murder of Feigl. Subsequently, he secured an arrest warrant that allowed him to apprehend the culprits. Mysteriously, the arrest papers that documented the evidence that helped secure the arrest warrant got missing, but Marshal Andrews was able to convince Judge Isaac Parker that the accused men were guilty as charged. During the trial, James Arsene denied having knowledge of the killing. However, the incoherent nature of the things he said afterward meant the judge couldn't really trust his testimonies. At first, Arsene claimed he was 33 years old at the time he was rearrested, meaning that he must have been 20 when the crime was committed. He also maintained that he was innocent of the charges brought against him. But as the trial progressed, Arsene recanted his first statement. He confessed that he was the one who pulled the trigger on Feigl 6 times. Interestingly, Parchmeal's testimony was consistent with with this statement. He confirmed to the jury was present at the scene of the incident. However, he claimed that he was there under duress and Arsene was solely responsible for the murder. Nonetheless, Judge Isaac Parker, nicknamed the Hanging Judge, approved the death penalty sentence for both Arsene and Parchmeal. On June 26, 1885, Arsene and Parchmeal had their limbs tied and their faces covered as they were executed under heavy rain at the gallows in Fort Smith, Kansas. This verdict came as no surprise to many people, as Judge Parker had previously presided over 77 other cases that ended in execution. But this was different, considering that James Arsene was reportedly 10 years old when the crime was committed, which makes him the youngest juvenile offender to be hanged in the United States. Carlos de Luna. When Carlos de Luna set out to execute his daily tasks on the 4th of February, 1983, he had no clue whatsoever that his life was about to change for the worse. His nightmarish stint started at night of the said day when Wanda Lopez, a 24-year-old attendant at the Senor Shamrock gas station, was attacked and killed violently by an unknown attacker. By the time police officers arrived at the scene, they found Lopez's dead body on the floor with multiple knife wounds. Coincidentally, Carlos de Luna just happened to be in the gas station when the police arrived, and upon hearing their siren, he fled the scene and hid under a truck a few blocks away. Suspecting he may have been the assailant, residents who had seen him notified the police, and at least 2 of the witnesses who claimed to have been at the gas station when the incident occurred identified Carlos as the assailant. But some of the evidence didn't seem to tally, and despite some witnesses testifying that the assailant was involved in a physical scuffle with the attendant, Carlos didn't have a bloodstain on him. During the trial held in 1983, Carlos de Luna maintained his innocence, claiming he had been mistaken for the real criminal named Carlos Hernandez. Carlos said he'd met Hernandez on the night of the incident. As old friends would do, both men exchanged pleasantries, and Hernandez headed for the gas station, while Carlos went to a bar directly across the road. After a while, Carlos decided to check on his buddy to see why he was taking too long, and that was when he saw Hernandez wrestling with the attendant, and that was when he fled the scene to avoid getting arrested by the police. Unfortunately for Carlos, the jury saw his story as a mere fabrication. They concluded that Hernandez was a fictional character made up by Carlos de Luna, perhaps to distract the prosecutors. At the end of the trial, Carlos got a death sentence and he was executed by lethal injection in December 1989. 4 years later, Professor James Liebman and 12 students launched a meticulous investigation into his case. In no time, they found that Carlos Hernandez indeed existed. The investigators found that Hernandez had a long history of crime. He had been arrested 39 times, including 13 times for carrying a knife. They tracked every possible lead, interviewing over 100 witnesses and examining around 900 pieces of source materials, crime scene pictures, and legal documents, which measured over 10 feet in height. Additional insights emerged when a private investigator, hired by Liebman, uncovered crucial evidence within 24 hours that had eluded the authorities for years. Shockingly, the police had neglected to obtain usable fingerprints or forensically analyze items for blood or saliva. Even the murder weapon remained insufficiently examined. With all of these inconsistencies, it's difficult to see how the jury came to the conclusion that Carlos de Luna was the assailant. Ruben Kantu. Growing up in the crime-ridden neighborhood of Barrio San Antonio, Ruben Kantu learned to embrace crime and illegality at a young age. At 15, he was already orchestrating carjacking and other auto theft operations. Despite being a teenager, Kantu drove stolen cars from the United States into Mexico, where they were sold. He had several close run-ins with the police. Ruben Kantu remained a free man and was never convicted of any crime up until November 1984, when he was caught in the middle of a robbery and murder scandal. According to reports, 2 gunmen stormed a construction site in San Antonio at around 11:30 p.m. Upon their arrival at the site, they met 2 workmen, Pedro Gomez and Juan Moreno, sleeping. The gunmen woke them rudely and ordered that they tendered their valuables, including the money they had earned as wages. Somewhere along the line, Gomez attempted to retrieve a pistol underneath his mattress, possibly to scare off the attackers. But his little genius move was met with more violence as he was shot 9 times until he died. Juan Moreno was also shot multiple times, losing 1 lung and kidney in the process, but he managed to survive the attack. With very little evidence to work with, the police went in search of the assailant. Moreno had told the authorities that the attack was carried out by 2 Latino teenagers between the ages of 14 and 19. In no time, news of the incident and Moreno's description of the murderer had spread across town. Rumor mongers recycled this information several times until it was concluded that Ruben Kantu, a 9th grader at the South San Antonio High School, was responsible for the murder. As there was no concrete evidence against Kantu, the case went cold. However, it was brought back to life when Kantu shot Joe De La Luz, an off-duty officer, 4 times. Thankfully for Kantu, the police officer survived the attack, and the case was deemed unprosecutable because the authorities had carried out an illegal search on Kantu's home. home. So, Ruben Kantu walked away as a freeman. However, Sergeant Bill Ewell, a close friend of Officer De La Luz, was keen to get revenge for his buddy. He reopened the murder case against Kantu, and after multiple attempts, he was able to get Juan Moreno to confess that Ruben Kantu was responsible for the murder. With Juan's confession, prosecutors were able to get a death penalty sentence for Ruben Kantu, and a few minutes after midnight on August 24, 1993, he was executed by lethal injection. Before his death, Kantu left a note that reads, "I have been framed in a capital murder case. I was framed because I shot an off-duty police officer named Joe De La Luz." Thanks for watching this video to the end. If you've enjoyed it, please click on any of the cards on the screen to watch more interesting videos like this one.